When I made my earlier video about the Irish potato famine, I knew that I would be remiss if I didn't also make a video about the famines in India under British colonial rule. So let's get into it. Grant, thank you so much for this comment. I do want to talk about the famine in Bengal in 1943, but I want to take it back a little bit earlier. So let's get into it. So the history of famine in India is a huge topic, but in this video, I want to focus specifically on the role of the British colonial government in the Bihar famine in 1873 and the Great Famine of 1876. This was after the so-called Irish potato famine, what they called the Great Hunger in Ireland. So this is what the British did after that all went down. First of all, in 1873, there had been any number of large-scale famines in India under British colonial rule from the time that India was governed by the British East India Company to the time it came under the rule of the British Crown. There were periodic famines, some of them very extreme. And so in the Bihar famine in 1873, the British government decided to take action. When the signs of famine were coming, when the monsoon rains failed and the crop failed in Bihar, there was British government officials who were tasked with preventing famine, and they spent some money and they provided food to the populace, and the number of people who died in this famine was 0. Nobody died. Everybody was fine. But 3 years later, and India is facing an even more extreme famine. There is a drought. That drought lasts for 3 rainy seasons. There's no rain for 3 years. And the crop fails catastrophically. This is a huge famine. And the man who was in charge of famine relief in India, who had overseen the famine relief for the Bihar famine, who had done such a great job that nobody died, he was told by his higher-ups, people in charge, that he had spent too much money in 1873. He spent way too much money, and he wasn't allowed to spend that much money anymore. So when this famine happened, they did essentially nothing. They had the means to distribute food. They had demonstrated that 3 years earlier. They had the ability to see that a famine was happening and to solve it. And they did it in 1873. But in 1876, they decided it was too expensive, wasn't worth it. Wasn't worth it, too expensive. And what did that mean? It meant that between 5.5 and 10 million people died as a result of this famine. We don't have the exact numbers. There's some debate as to whether it's 6.5 or 9.5. A lot of people just kind of pick a number in the middle and say, okay, it was 8.5. 8.5 million people. I just want you to think about that number for a second. In 2 years, when they had demonstrated that they could, if they wanted to, prevent that level of catastrophic death. But it was too expensive. Now, unlike the potato famine in Ireland, and unlike some past famines in India, the failure of the colonial government in 1876 to prevent this catastrophic level of fatalities in this famine, which they had demonstrated that they could do, they just didn't want to because it was too expensive, which I have to sit with that for a second. That led to a lot of blowback, and they did actually, at that point, at the colonial government level, institute what they called the famine codes, which meant that they did have to, by law, intervene if there was a famine and provide food. So after between 6.5 and 9.5 million people died, they finally thought, oh, well, maybe we should actually pay for famine relief. So what happened in the famine that the commenter was referring to, the Bengal famine of 1843? Well, I'll tell you. There were these famine codes in place. By law, they should have taken steps to intervene in this famine. But what else was happening in 1943? Anyone? Anyone? Class? World War II. This was in the middle of World War II. And if any of you, like me, have watched a million British period dramas and seen the rations and the not having enough stockings to go to the dance and making dresses out of parachute silk, we've seen it, right? So we know there's rationing. And there's rationing because the British government is fighting a war literally around the globe. They are defending their dying empire. So they are, to say the least, overstretched. And they do not want to adhere to the famine codes because they want to feed their army instead. So they ignored the famine codes, and between 1 million and 4 million people in Bengal starve in this famine. And the 1943 famine in Bengal was a huge springboard for the independence movement. Part of the reason for that was there were Indian nationals who were fighting in the British Army. There were a lot of Indian nationals fighting in the British Army. And they're being told that they should fight for this government that allows their family members to starve. It just didn't compute, didn't make sense. And mind you, it's not like the people living under British colonial rule in India didn't know that British colonial rule was BS. They did. And there were many uprisings over the history of British colonial rule in India. But the one that was successful came out of the hypocrisy of having Indian nationals fighting for the British government while the British government was letting their family members starve at home. And I think it's really interesting that post-independence, India has made it a very, very high priority to prevent famine and starvation at every level. There are lots of flaws in the Indian government, as there are in any human endeavor. But one thing that they have done consistently, very, very well, is keep people from starving. School children in India are guaranteed food by law through the whole country. And it's an enormous, enormous country. We think we're a big country. That's a big country with a lot of people. And they feed school children in India every day, consistently. They have 1 billion people, and they feed every single child in that country because they went through such insane famines under British rule, and they will not let it happen anymore. So to say that famines like this, hunger like this, was not a tool used by colonialists to keep the population weak. It was a tool of oppression. At the very least, it was a tool of oppression.